Hello, everyone. This is Jerry Boyer from Harmonized Mobility. We're still waiting for a few people to join, so bear with us, and we'll start in about 2 minutes. Hi, everyone. For those of you who just joined, we're going to wait for about 1 more minute, and we're going to get started. There's a few people that are still joining, so bear with us. Okay, everyone, it's about time to get started. My name is Jerry Boyer, and I am a co-founder of Harmonized Mobility, and I will be your webinar host today. I'm hosting from near Toronto, and it's a beautiful snowy day here in Toronto. A little bit about Harmonized Mobility. Our goal is to help communities reach their transportation goals. With rapid advances in technology and connectivity, we see an achievable transportation future that takes advantage of these new technologies and includes everyone, minimizes environmental impacts, and mitigates congestion. We do offer educational workshops. As a matter of fact, our next 2-day course is being held at Surrey City Hall in BC on December 5th and 6th. We also provide consulting and technology platforms designed to serve our clients' ability to reach their transportation goals. A little bit about the book that you see on the screen right now. It is the End of Driving, and the information that we're presenting today is adapted from this book. And we just happen to have the co-authors of the book, Bern Grush and John Niles, with us today. Bern will be leading today's discussion, and John Niles, who is also on the call, will be available to answer your questions if needed. As for the webinar, I will be managing the technology and controls. All attendees will remain muted, and you do have the ability to ask questions from the GoToWebinar control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. We are planned to be together for 1 hour. Bern has about 45 minutes of material to present, leaving some time for questions and answers. We will do our best to answer all questions. So let's get started. Thank you very much for being with us today, and I'll turn it over to Bern.
Thank you. Thank all of you for joining us today. I'm Bern Grush, as mentioned, co-author of the book that you see on the left. For the most part, the ideas that I'm going to be presenting today are from that book. There's a few others that have been developed since John and I wrote the book. And I'm going to be presenting all of these and many, many more in much greater detail in the group discussion in the 2-day course that we'll be giving, as Jerry mentioned, in December 4th and 5th in Surrey. What will happen at the end at the question and answer session is John is certainly available to contribute and answer some of the questions at that point, if that works out. So this talk and the book are really intended for urban and suburban and transit planners, as well as public sector mobility innovators in the mode of public-private collaboration. We're very much interested in how to best collaborate amongst the innovators and the providers and the operators and public transit and the public need for mobility. So there's a very important nexus of collaboration there. And we think that the coming era of automation and the way in which mobility will be mechanized and managed will require a rather new level of coordination. It's not more of the same, but it's a new kind and a new level of coordination amongst public and private entities. As an aside, and related to this, as I was developing this webinar in these last few days, a recent posting from PricewaterhouseCoopers Canada, PwC Canada, just came out this morning, and a quote from that is, the theme is to collaborate effectively with their private sector partners. Public transit agencies need to establish a more agile approach to governance. I thought that was a perfect note to start on, because that's really the fundamentals of what John and I have been working on for these last 4 or 5 years. And we're going to touch on one of those ideas later today as well. There's an uncountable number of issues that one might consider when planning for autonomous vehicles, besides all the technology and the timing and the costs that we're all sort of hearing and somewhat familiar with. There are key issues of whether we will be buying vehicles or buying rides, or if we buy rides, will they be shared or solo? So today, if you were to survey all the light duty vehicles carrying passengers in North America, setting aside buses and trains for the moment, and heavy trucks and so on, but just talking about passenger vehicles, probably something on the order of 90 to 95% of those are privately owned family vehicles of some sort or another, and perhaps something on the order of 5% or less are taxis or shuttles in commercial use. In the future, it is assumed, I'm not predicting, it's just assumed, the small vehicle passenger travel, excluding large transit vehicles, will range from the extremes of everyone will own a car on the left to the other extreme of no one will own a car. I don't think either of those are true. I think there will be a mix, but the key for us is what proportion will that mix be? Frankly, nobody really knows. Now, I have watched and read and sometimes even succumbed to autonomous vehicle hype for the past decade. I think a lot of us have. In my view, positive hype peaked in 2015 and has become considerably more negative since then. Today, it is commonplace to hear AV leaders such as John Krafcik of Waymo express the difficulty with the final stages of their project, that project being level 5 automation, and suggesting that completely driverless vehicles, which are driverless in any and every circumstance, may not come about for several decades, if at all. So what's more concerning than whether the technology will ever match the consumer perfection of the concept vehicles we are often shown is the question of all the contexts around these vehicles, their fleets, the maintenance of their operating contexts, the effects on pedestrian freedom of movement, connection to transit or disruption of transit, new or changed infrastructure they may need, and so on. The hardest question may be, how will they exist in massive numbers alongside equally massive numbers of non-automated vehicles during the several decades of fleet turnover? It's very easy to think about the end game. It's very hard to think about how we're going to get from here to there. This quote that you see on the screen from Kurt Forsgren of S&P is really as insightful as it gets. What is in front of us indeed will be complex, will be hard to predict, and will be highly fragmented. However, there is a lot that we can expect to soon be able to do with level 4 vehicles, which is really the focus of my talk today, that operate without a driver, but in geofenced areas. In other words, areas that are constrained and managed for their safe and predictable use. Such vehicles can act to move people and goods within certain areas and eventually whole towns and regions and cities at some point. In other words, these vehicles, the ones that we're on the verge of seeing, are more suited as robo-taxis and shuttles and less so as a personal vehicle. I will talk about some ideas to manage fleets in this use domain. The key point of this optimism is that I think we have a new opportunity, that we must ask what it is that we want to achieve rather than what it is that what do we suppose will happen to us. In other words, we need to define a vision. With that, I'm going to touch on 7 ideas from the work that John and I have developed over the course of our of writing our book and in the time following. The first two involve ways in which government might own and operate fleets designed as public transit, perhaps with P3 involvement or not, or ways that government might specify and regulate privately owned fleets from operators such as GM and Ford and Uber or Lyft or Waymo and so on. We think that the current competition and collaboration between TNCs such as Uber and Lyft and others and public transit provide a preview of what we might expect. We're going to look at some of those ideas. The next two are about changes, both attrition and strengthening of existing bus and mass transit systems. Without these, we think overwhelming numbers of small vehicles would make our larger cities unworkable. I will talk about some transit-oriented development ideas, some sidewalk and curb issues, and remind us of the critical need to focus on the mobility disadvantaged as I wrap up. Asking the question of how we get from no autonomous vehicles to large, effective fleets integrated with public transit, we consider the limitations of automation and the necessity of managing the movements of those early fleets, the ones that we are expecting pretty soon but haven't seen yet. We know we must constrain their locations and operating domains. This is called geofencing. The early fleets will be small. They will have limited coverage, and they should, if possible, be integrated with transit. We think that's the smartest way to do it. And we see lots of places where people are looking at these small shuttles of first and last mile to train stations, for example. So that's in line with this. Of course, this whole thing gives rise to many questions. Where will we locate these early fleets? What purposes besides the one that I just mentioned? What should be the mix of fixed schedule versus on demand? Right now, they're kind of fixed schedule because it's too early in the game. What infrastructure is needed? How can we future-proof that infrastructure as these fleets get bigger? How and when could or should private vehicles be integrated or even banned from these operating areas? Again, not saying they should be, but we need to ask those questions. Here is a concept that John and I have called transit leap. The concept of leaps mimics the 5 SEE levels of automation, except that it is describing spatial urban expansions enabled by the gradual driverless capabilities of AVs and the acceptance, the user acceptance of this mode of transit. So these levels are about the about spatial extent and acceptance, not about the technology per se. It's not about the levels of automation. It's all expected to be at least level 4. All transit leaps are fully driverless. The first leap is what we see already in many dozens of small trials of shuttles, still with safety drivers. These only become leap 1 systems when those safety drivers are removed. So we really don't have these yet. We think we're going to have them any day, but we don't have them yet. Anyway, these routes are going to be short, fixed, repetitive, and slow at first. Leap 2 becomes useful in neighborhoods and campuses. Still leaving current public transit largely intact, hopefully complementing it, for example, by funneling riders to trains or BRT. Leap 3 starts to meld and blend many Leap 2s into larger, meaningful areas. This is the tipping point that affects large areas, public transit, infrastructure, and so on. And this is a problem since any large areas have zones that are easy to prepare into Leap 2s and other zones full of barriers to conversion that would make it very difficult. This means that planning Leap 2s must have Leap 3 in mind, or the system becomes fragmented, as mentioned earlier. So it goes on to full coverage from there. Transit leaps move through early stages of ACES, this automated connected, as I think we're all familiar with, and later to what we call CAFE. In other words, to really have almost everyone consider using this form of transit as opposed to having their own private vehicle. These vehicles will need to be consumer competitive with the vehicles that one can already own. We can't expect everyone to switch if the kind of services that are offered are at the rather limited level of today's taxis and buses. It's not going to be sufficient to move people to these systems en masse. We go into much more detail of this in the course, and including a staged planning model that we call AV eras, which I won't be talking about today, and helps planners partition what needs to happen to start and what it is that can be deferred as you go through these various stages. To this point, John Niles, of course, in Seattle, is working on Transit Leap for the city of SeaTac, Washington. And we can respond to any related questions to that project with John at the question and answer period, as Jerry mentioned earlier. In any case, we also like to explore ideas from many cities, especially as this coursework in this book has an international spin, an international purpose. Here's a concept from Barcelona, where I'll be leading this workshop in February, in which small areas, here an aggregate of 3x3 blocks, this is a pretty well-known area in Barcelona, and it's highly regular, so it's a little bit artificial in that sense for a North American city. But what happens, the idea is to begin to exclude motor vehicles. So in this case, this is about only active transportation. It's not about automated vehicles. However, what Transit Leap would extends this idea by providing autonomous transit within these areas and permitting the spatial aggregation of adjacent blocks of blocks. So instead of 3x3, it's easy to become 9x9 and so on, and to start eventually covering the whole region and eventually the whole city. Again, that eventually, as I showed earlier, that might take 25 or 30 years, but it's the concept is to move out in groups like that. Two of the key ideas for planning the evolution of AV transit with Transit Leaps, in addition to focusing on shared mobility, either shared vehicles and shared rides, of course, are two things. First of all, you start by clustering operational networks of automated shuttles and robotaxis to maximize ridership. That's what you want to do in Leap 2 and 3, is you want to affect as many people's mobility as possible. So you would choose those Leap 2 and Leap 3 areas for ridership purposes. In the end, you want to justify and document how you're doing those fleet expansions and those spatial expansions in order to maximize coverage in Leap 4 and 5. So ridership first, coverage second, as you get through eventually through the entire region. Okay. The second thing I want to look at is governing commercial for hire fleets. So that first thing, those fleets might be owned and operated, P3s or government. These is talking about fleets that are not owned and operated. These are fleets, absolutely commercial fleets. These might be Waymo and Uber fleets that are operated by those companies. Now, over the past 5 years, there have been numerous reports warning about the negative outcomes and potential opportunities of large fleets of AVs which they may have on congestion, on transit, and on the mobility disadvantage, either for better or for worse. And the advice of all these reports is consistent. Integrate with transit. Demand the performance characteristics your city needs, the people you need to move, the places you need to move them to and from, the occupancy levels of the vehicles being used, sharing those vehicles, the fuel, and so on. Subsidize these systems as needed to achieve the desired performance. Use road pricing, especially these commercial operators that are operating autonomous vehicles for profit. Deploy road pricing, especially to fund the subsidies. I mean, design the system so as much as possible so that the system can be somewhat, not completely, but somewhat self-funding to reduce the subsidy load on government. Maximize sharing, measure everything, and acquire and secure data, which is currently a sore point sometimes, but that's certainly a sore point in those studies. There's already, just looking for a moment at transit and TTC partnerships, there's already on the order of about 100 partnerships between transit agencies and commercial transportation providers. There's probably a lot more if you look at every taxi relationship and so on. But just talking in the last few years, predominantly Uber and Lyft, but not only, because Via Bus has some now, and there's also been some from other microtransit carriers. In any case, the boundary lines are a little blurred because, you know, the microtransit operators kind of have usually have a different business model than TNCs, but now some of the TNC operators are looking at microtransit as well, so it's getting blurred. In any case, what happens is that each of these has a transit authority, That's the subsidizer on the left. That sets the performance criteria, and it's usually about the 5 things listed. It's usually about first, last mile, and guaranteed ride home, and so on. We'll see those again. And the criteria for this is set. So where do we want to move people to and from, and when we want to do it, and so forth. Because we don't provide blanket subsidies, we want to subsidize only the elements that are missing from our existing transit systems, for instance. And then it also includes a ride provider that agrees to provide the required ride services and a degree of aggregated data or data summaries to be provided by the agency. Now that's an uneven process, but nonetheless, that's the general idea. You may know about 2 of these many examples. There's one with Lyft with Pierce Transit in Tacoma, and there's another one quite well known with Uber in Innisfil, Ontario. We look at a lot of these in the course. We look at several of them because it's instructive to see the differences amongst them and the commonalities amongst them. There are some exceptions with a ride provider having an agreement with a retailer such as Waymo and Walmart. So it fits this partnership agreement model, but it's not about people. In this case, it's not about transit. In this case, it's about people getting to shop. Or it's really about Walmart attracting customers, if you want to look at it that way, because they're both commercial entities. And some agencies have agreed with 2 or 3 providers. There are some cities, some transit agencies have agreed with Lyft and Uber at the same time. And there's even one that did Lyft and Uber and 2 taxis. So there could be multiple multiple two-way agreements in this case. There's also been a number of partnering agreements among microtransit companies and employers, for example. Pick up from your home and take you to work. There's not even, it's kind of a replacement for transit in that case. What's in common is there's collaboration between ride providers and the subsidizer, or people demanding transportation for some purpose or other. Anyway, the conceptual elements may vary, but the concept is the same. Now, let's think about replacing that agreement with a platform. In other words, what if all the same players operated through a governance platform in the cloud instead of those one-to-one relationships that we just described? And what would happen in a governance platform in the cloud is that would hold the geographies, the related performance demands, the subsidy schedules in all the detail that's needed would be stored in that aggregated subsidy pool. So the aggregated subsidy pool is the aggregated money from employers and retailers and agencies, and also the aggregated subsidies that are being offered. So in other words, let's look at it left to right. The transit agencies, employers, and retailers input the trip times, the places, and the people they wish to subsidize. They put that into the governance platform. These are we call these transportation demanders. The ride providers of every modality that are registered and permitted in a jurisdiction to operate. So you can't engage in this platform unless you're registered and legally provide a legal provider of transportation in a jurisdiction that has the subsidy on offer. We call these ride providers, of course. The users would make a request for a trip through some MOS interface or not. We don't care what the MOS interface is. It comes in through the MOS interfaces into this system, and the ride they need and the subsidy would be calculated, assigned, and audited by the governance platform. And these users are called trip demanders. So this is what we're proposing to transit agencies today who are dealing with Uber and Lyft, for example, because that's what's available today. But it's also that they are anticipating robo-taxis in the future. So the assumption is that the difficulties or the world of managing Uber and Lyft now will grow considerably larger as these fleets materialize. Again, I'm not saying when, but the control does stay with the subsidizer. So it's the employers, retailers, and agencies that say what money goes where. Here's what it looks like from the viewer's perspective. This system that I'm describing has an invisible mode and a visible mode. What the visible mode looks like is that a user enters a trip origin and destination into an app. That's the app called HMS in this case. And they view the ride choices that happen to be available and based on whatever subsidies happen to be available for that ride. So if it's a person, for example, that is going to a train station and there happens to be a subsidy for exiting a transit desert, and there's also a subsidy for entering the train depot, then those would be aggregated. For example, I mean, there's other aggregations. You can imagine somebody leaving a transit desert subsidized by the transit agency, but arriving at work subsidized by the employer. So that would be aggregated. We can aggregate across providers and within as well. As it goes on, the user selects what they want to do. In this case, they decided to use a taxi called Saltar. That's actually a fictional name because I didn't want to pick a local taxi name that wasn't familiar, so I chose made up names in this case. So that would be like taxi number 2. And we then launch that app. The apps have to be these providers, the ride providers have to be online, have to be on the net. The ride is provided by that ride provider. It's completed. A token is sent back to the system that confirms that that particular ride that was promised, the ride that was asked for, the subsidy that was promised, all match up. That has to match in order to credit the ride provider and then create the invoice to, and it just says city here, but it should say to the transportation demander. It could be to the employer. It could be to the retailer and so forth. So that's kind of what the system looks like to the user. The value of having these agreements aggregated on a platform is that from a regional perspective or a city or regional perspective, we now have a many-to-many relation, many ride providers and many subsidizers, so that a user has a whole mobility marketplace instead of just, I used the example in Innisfil. If you wanted to use transit in Innisfil, you have one choice. But if you were in a larger city like Toronto or Vancouver or Seattle, you would like to have multiple choices. And I think the transit agencies and the employers and retailers would like that as well. It's also plug and play for new modalities. So let's just say you're in a city that decides to permit scooters, for example, and the scooters are online and they're eligible for a subsidy, let's say. Then it's simply a matter of the scooter operator being permitted to be a provider or user of the subsidies, and then it's automatically on the system. There's agency value in the data aggregation. So not only is there data aggregation for them, but the data aggregation is available to employers and to retailers. There's ways to have negotiations among all players, the transit players and the employers as well, to find yet a richer understanding of transportation needs from a urban planning and transportation planning perspective. Procurement flexibility is far higher, and we're minimizing risk because now there's not a single provider that may change their business practice or may go out of business or may have a strike of their drivers, whatever. The risk is minimized because there's multiple providers. So the user has far greater choice. The subsidies are aggregated, as I mentioned. And of course, if some of the subsidies coming from retailers and employers, the transit subsidy that taxpayers usually have to bear is reduced. So looking at the next element, I'm going to much more quickly now because there's only a couple slides left for each one of these. The point here, when you think about the expectation or the potential possibility of gradual attrition, and I will talk about strengthening this as well, but at this point, it's possible that there will be gradual attrition, expectation for fixed route transit, kind of focused on the bus, not focused on rail. In any case, specifically about buses, if there is an underperforming bus system, there's usually a degree of social pressure to retain it because there's always some people that really need that bus or are really relying on it, even if it's quite few. However, if there's financial pressure because of ridership counts and fare counts and so on, financial pressure forces forces people to forces agencies to cut underperforming systems. And that's what usually happens, sadly, and realistically. And of course, what that does is that creates a vicious cycle, since more service cuts mean that ridership falls off further, and it goes around the cycle. So this process is ongoing in ways that will be hard to predict. Typically, it will start more slowly than futurists project, and then proceed more rapidly once the tipping point is reached. So at some point, this could go bad quickly for small towns or small cities that rely entirely and only on their bus system. So that's kind of the focus here. I'm not talking about massive bus systems in large cities, certainly not at first. What happens then usually is that there's the usual S curve. It goes slow, and then it happens fast. And when that tipping point happens and it finally takes hold, it would certainly go quickly, but it won't happen the same way everywhere. It won't happen the same in every city. It won't happen the same in every area and every route. So that would be fairly complex. What we want to do is we want to govern the gradual attrition of fixed route transit. We want to guard the viability of large vehicle fixed route transit, which I'm going to be talking about in the next slide. We want to move forward on the addition of microtransit routes with smaller vehicle types, manual at first, automated later, but only in places in low density geographies, and for all trip purposes, not just for first last mile, but for the population that has other needs, getting to medical or getting to school and so on, that might be needed in low density geographies, for which these existing systems would be under stress. So looking at the relevance of mass transit, to retain mass transit, like these are again larger vehicles. They could be bus rapid transit, but think about what we do now. People reach transit stations and hubs by bus, car, and active modes. This will be challenged. We already see this being challenged in several of our larger cities, just with Uber and Lyft. I mean, there's been very clear evidence that there's been some encroachment on transit ridership. It's also the case that there's evidence that it's helpful, but the net has been in larger cities that it's been negative somewhat. So today's rail systems, by just to think about the effect of reducing ridership entering these systems, especially if it happens precipitously from automated vehicles. If transit users, these transit stations themselves, on average in North America, are 1.3 kilometers apart. I mean, that's there for walkability reasons. So if a transit user has access to cheap, automated, on-demand modes, for example, in 5 or 7 or 12 years, they have easy access to robotic taxis and shuttles, that they may elect to avoid using crowded trains to go through 15 or 20 subway stops or BRT stops once they've settled into a robotaxi. So if you have a long train ride in front of you that is crowded and there's no seat and so on, you're very likely just to stay with the robotaxi if in fact they're inexpensive, and there'll be a lot of competition to get your business by these commercial entities. And so, you've already started your email and you're looking at a video. Why not just stay in there when that's going to cause a tremendous amount of congestion if that occurs? So one way to future-proof rail transit during maintenance cycles, in other words, when we rebuild stations have a 50-year lifetime, and we're building it. So in Toronto, we're building new subways. In some cities we are. In many cities in the world, that new subways are going in. There's a lot going in the Middle East, for example. So one way to future-proof these is to ensure that medium-length trips are attractive. So if I'm going to get on the train and going for eight stops now, it would be far better if they were fewer stops. So the idea is to build the stations that are, instead of 1.3 kilometers apart, build them 5 miles or 6 or 7 kilometers apart, so that they act as a funnel for automated vehicles to bring people to the stations. But getting in and out of the stations, there's a very large egress. There's a lot of places for these vehicles to pull over and operate. There's a whole TOD around the area. It's really designed for massive numbers of people to be dropped off to get onto the train, and so that the train can go very quickly, instead of stopping 12 times, only stops twice or once, to get people to those very high density areas that they want to get to, for example. So again, I think I'll underscore that this is really also a transit-oriented development approach to this. Speaking of transit-oriented development, today's transit-oriented radius is somewhere between 600 to 800 meters. This is like a quarter of a mile, half a mile. That's for kind of walkability. Sort of the rule of thumb is people are willing to do a 10-minute walk, or they're willing to walk 700 or 800 meters. Not a lot of people are willing to walk a lot more, sadly. In any case, consider the introduction of AV shuttles. Instead of thinking about walking, think about how far you can get in 10 minutes at 20 kilometers per hour average. Now these vehicles are expected to go twice as fast, but the vehicles would be shared and we would stop. So if you lived at the periphery of such a TOD that happens to be at 3.3 kilometers instead of 3.3 kilometers instead of 0.8 kilometers, then you would be stopping to pick a couple people up. So it might take you 10 minutes to get that short distance because it's a shared vehicle, and it's on average moving only 20 kilometers an hour, which is kind of the way people move now in cities, if you think about it, because of all the stop and go when we come downtown. What this would do is this would expand the average TOD area from today's 2 square kilometers. So if you build a TOD today, that's 800 meters at radius, that's 2 square kilometers. They would now expand to 32 square kilometers, which is huge. It's a small city. And at density of 5,000 per square kilometer, that's 160,000 population. So imagine, a string of dense, compact towns along a regional railroad. So going back to that original idea that I just spoke about, you can put in rail systems that are really urban and interurban rail systems that are meant to get people to commute every day, and to address both affordability issues, because these TODs would be they could be a little flatter. They don't have to be quite as vertical as the ones that we build now. So there's opportunities really to rethink that 10-minute radius. I talk about a 10-minute radius as a 10-minute time radius. Once is walking, once is travel. So there's a whole rethink that we can do there. The second last thing I want to look at is the opportunity to manage I call it the lawless sidewalk and curb. There are a huge number of sidewalk configurations. There's probably no two the same. There are sidewalks that have been recently revamped and widened. You can see in the upper left, obviously the street has been narrowed in some way and the sidewalk has been widened. Sadly, it's underused, but nonetheless, this is just a photograph. On the right is a very old street. This happens to be in Philadelphia, and you can take a car. That pathway is wide enough for a car. You can see the car there. But if you start thinking about these sidewalks having automated delivery vehicles and automated wheelchairs and all sorts of people getting in and out of AVs and so forth, you can start to imagine the complexity of such an area. On the bottom left that happens to be in Barcelona, and that's a day in which the traffic was stopped. So it's a little bit unusual in terms of, but there are I've seen many times in larger cities at rush hour with a huge amount of pedestrians on the street. So how are we going to manage these environments with pickup and drop off of vehicles and also the sidewalk vehicles as well? In the center is a street that near me. That's a bus stop. I have to navigate that intersection almost every day. And I actually have to walk out in the roadway to get around all the people waiting for the bus. It's not that they won't move over. They can't move over. It's just too many people in that spot. That whole intersection never contemplated a bus stop for whatever reason. I don't know the reason. And again, on the left, here's a situation where a woman pushing a pram, the woman that's walking in the opposite direction had to move aside to get past. I know it's under construction, but if you look at the top picture with those trees and poles, two people couldn't pass very easily on those streets as well. There's a lot of places like this. There's many more uses. There's skateboards. There's more people on bicycles. There's bicycle storage areas. There's now scooters. There's conflicts with delivery vehicles. There's people leaving. And so there's so many things going on the sidewalk that are all non-standardized, unspecified, unregulated, and we don't know what to do with all of them. These new delivery vehicles are going to be a problem. I don't think we're going to be landing packages with air drones, but we are going to be delivering packages with sidewalk drones unless they're banned. We're going to be losing income. We are designing streets now. If you look at this from NACTO on the bottom right, a very wonderful design. I don't think there's nearly enough appreciation of drop-offs in that particular drawing. I don't know. I'm not a planner, but we don't thinking about these things very clearly. The two major issues are loading people and loading goods. Both of these pictures I took not far from where I live. What taxis do now, or Ubers and Lyfts, they all do the same thing. They want to stop for a passenger. You stop near where the passenger is. The passenger finds his way in. You block, in this case, 2 lanes, bicycle lane and taxi lane. On the right is a Canada Post truck blocking part of a sidewalk, part of a lane. And you know there's no provision for that person to deliver packages because these were all built before the massive amount of Amazon deliveries. This is probably delivering from Amazon, for example. I don't know what it's delivering, but the point is that this is all changing very rapidly and is putting tremendous demand on the sidewalk. Here's another one. This is a person that uses a wheelchair. She was crossing this street. We don't have a picture of the event itself, but she came to the ramp where a Starship delivery zone drone, like that one, not that one, but like that one, was stopped in the ramp, in the center of the ramp, and she couldn't mount the ramp. And so she was stranded in the crosswalk, in the road. She was quite scared. She wrote a lot about it, that she was quite frightened that she was going to be hit. She wasn't. Nothing happened. But it was... This is for sidewalk drones like Uber hit the pedestrian, the bicycle pedestrian 2 years ago. If something had happened to her, that would have put an end to sidewalk drones. So unspecified, and they didn't even think about it. They stopped. This Starship stopped their operation until they sort that problem out. They have a lot of problems, I think, that aren't being reviewed. So here's what's happening. There's a new ISO initiative, International Standards Organization, that I've started about 2 months ago. And that issue is about standardizing behavior for automated vehicles for arriving, stopping, parking, waiting, and loading. There's a whole new degree of precision, variety, demand increase, and we have the ongoing parallel problem of lower human attention. So while all this complexity is going on, we're going to have every pedestrian walking around looking at their phone. We're going to have a mess on these sidewalks. So what we've done is we've started to name, we're just looking for how it is that we're going to define these sidewalks for their behavior, levels of behavior. So we're using levels. Again, it's modeled after the SAE levels again, so that we would have, for example, like no consideration at all. Like we don't do or care about anything. You're all on your own. And then we get to level 2 where there's kind of like a monitored automation. It's mostly manual operations. People in manual wheelchairs or bicycles are allowed and people get along. And if there's automation permitted, then a person's going to be with it. So you're not going to, so level 3, you can have some mixed and monitored automation. Maybe the sidewalk drones can, under certain circumstances, use some of these sidewalks and there'd be a set of rules for that. I don't know what those rules are. We haven't developed them yet. And at some point, they'd be highly automated. They would be allowed to go unassisted, maybe assisted, but they could be fully automated, or they also might have some degree of guarded manual use at the same time. At some point, this is the ideal, and again, I'm not sure we'd ever get to this ideal, but you would have sidewalks with no manual vehicles, only and pedestrians walking around looking at their phone, getting tangled up. So this is the kind of thing we're trying to understand what it is that we do to describe these sidewalks and curbs, so that businesses can say our sidewalk is a level 4. Here's what's allowed to be delivered. Here's where the garbage is allowed to be put. Here's when you can put it, and so on. Because we have a highly automated sidewalk or curb, and so on. So I think you can just see there's a lot of issues there. It's going to be a very long and complex standard. Anybody on this call that's interested, I'm interested in collaboration and collaborators, because we're working with several countries and we need American and Canadian input as well. The last point I want to make before I stop is that the focus, the prime and best and most important focus, is to focus on mobility options for the disadvantaged. And disadvantage can include anything, including paratransit alternatives, but it includes off-peak time, guaranteed ride home, transit deserts, and so forth. The thing is that the opportunity that we have for employment justice, which is like job reach, can we use these systems to get people to their work, whether it's the TOD ideas or the transit leap ideas? Can we get people to work more readily without them having to own a vehicle that they may or may not be able to readily afford? Can we deal with environmental justice? Can we reduce VMT? Can we set up our initial systems to start in that way? Can we address social justice a little better than before? In some cities, you have to wait, you have to order a vehicle if you are disabled. You might have to order a vehicle at least 1, sometimes 2 days in advance. Can we shorten that to 2 hours or 1 hour? And of course, the urban justice of livability and so forth. There's another idea, universal basic mobility, that at least everybody has a fighting chance to get where they need to work, get where they need to shop. It might not be glorious and high status, but at least everybody has an opportunity to travel in some way. So with that, I just want to remind everybody that the course that we are doing, the 2-day course in which we're going to go in great depth with all of these things and many more, is on December 4th and 5th. There's a URL for.
Vern, I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second. It's actually the 5th and 6th of December, Thursday and Friday.
Gosh. I'm sorry.
Okay, it's close enough, but it is the 5th and 6th.
That's not that close. I'm sorry, everybody. I didn't notice that. All right, there's repaired. In any case, that's just a reminder that that's being offered. And as I'm going to open up for questions, turning it over to Jerry. Here is the course modules. There's 16 course modules. Each one is a half-an-hour lecture and a 15-minute discussion. So it's a workshop-oriented set of modules. Thank you, everybody. Jerry, do we have any questions?
Yeah, so Bern, I do have one question. You can probably see it yourself as well under the questions tab, but I'll read it. Can you elaborate on the work of intermodal connection of transportation within Vancouver and Surrey that occurred during their smart cities application? Was harmonized mobility involved in the final submission to the federal government of Canada?
No, we weren't involved in that, so I won't be able to speak to its details. John, do you know anything about that?
No, I only know what I've read a little bit about it. That's the answer is no.
Okay.
And we do have another question. Can we share the deck with the attendees? And the answer is yes.
John, did you want to make any comments about what you're up to in CTAC?
Yeah, we're at a very early stage on that. This is done in cooperation with the. Actually, it's under the aegis of the city of SeaTac, not the airport. The airport is aware of it, but the environment that seemed ripe for the city of SeaTac's interest in getting going on automated mobility were their neighborhoods. And so we did an examination of the residential neighborhoods around the airport. We were looking at slow speed shuttles because that's where it's at right now. But with further thinking and work with Metro Transit, we're also thinking that the way to start on this is to, in effect, simulate a kind of on-demand mobility that goes in places where the buses don't go for residential neighborhoods. and thinking that extending the new VIA option, via transit access by the VIA service, is a good way to simulate what automated mobility would be like to collect data. And that's probably the next place we'll be going. It is true that that automated transport is sometimes not as far along as is portrayed. Safety is paramount, and I think what's important is to establish some of the user patterns ahead of actually removing drivers from vehicles, which always has to be governed by safety and a lot of other considerations.
So, John, you mean determining that determining people's interest in on-demand?
Absolutely. So you have a service that's reachable with an app. It's at a particular price. It goes particular places. In the case of the King County Metro work with VIA, it goes to light rail stops. It's done in parts of South Seattle and Tukwila, a southern suburb, and a little bit into the neighborhood we were working in and the city of SeaTac. Let's see how far that goes. What do you get out of that? And then you can begin talking about, in the long run, changing the cost structure by having automated vehicles. I mean, that's in some ways that's what automation is about. In the long run, is changing the cost structure for transit and going all over a region where transit can't go now because you just can't afford it.
So what you're saying is, and I think I agree if that's what you're saying, is that we want to have more transit, not less. It's just that we want to be more effective in the transit that we're providing so that we can provide more with the same kinds of budgets that we're using now. Is that?
Well, that's exactly right.
Right.
Transit's not unlimited. I mean, cars are going to remain very popular, but focusing what you were focusing on with the mobility disabled in various ways, you have a lot of people who for whom that is an option, and so that's the market we would aim at first. So I would want to include the senior center in the destination list for services like that.
Right.
So we do have a few more questions if you guys are complete on that conversation.
Sure.
So one question is, what is the best city example of success that Harmonize is working with? And so, you know, from my perspective, and this is certainly an opinion, but the city of Vancouver is you know, just kind of quite a few steps ahead of everyone else. I mean, I think part of it has to do with the growth of their transit system and the fact that they don't have any ride hailing. So they have a chance to sit back and plan what the future is going to look like. So they're really taking quite an innovative approach. And so from my perspective, Vancouver would be the number one city that is really kind of leading by example. I don't know if you have a comment, Bern.
Yeah, I you know, as you well know, we're working with about 6 other cities in conversation and in planning. And one of the concerns is that none of those are public, and there's always a concern with the transit unions. So we're a little bit more public about Vancouver because we applied for and won a how do you call that? There was a
It was an open innovation call.
There was an innovation call, and we won that, and then there was hesitation in deployment because of the union issues. They're being worked out, and it's just taken a while. So we're cautious about saying the names of other cities, but there are a couple in the U.S. one is about 75,000 people, and one is quite a bit bigger. It's probably about 400,000. Both of them have bus systems. One of them has a subway as well. And you know, the one of them, and this is interesting, one of them is in an urban renewal circumstance, And as that urban renewal goes on, they can't really bring fixed transit in there yet. They don't know what the demand's going to be. They don't know where the routes are going to be. And of course, it's only partially renewed. It's a multi-year project. And so what they would like to do is they would like to provide transit to the people that are living there, but to do so either with on-demand shuttles or do that with the subsidy with Uber and Lyft, for example, the kind of subsidy I talked about a few slides ago. So that is the kind of application that's being looked at there.
Just kind of back to the city of Vancouver, they're also using the book written by Bern and John as a reference guide, and they're looking at right now creating kind of a regional transportation capability that kind of covers across all of the regions, at least in the Lower Mainland. So it's there's lots of interesting things going on, and Vancouver seems to be getting ahead of it, but other cities they have different challenges that they're trying to solve by working with us. There are other questions here, Bern. How do we as planners make sure that autonomous vehicles don't hasten inequity in the transportation field?
Well, we think two things about it. We think that the two planning ideas, the one is the spatial extent idea, the transit leap idea, which is just a diffusion concept. So how is it that you diffuse the fleets that are under government control? That be done in a way, and that's why I said that the areas and places and demographics chosen to do those systems would be chosen for the mobility disadvantage. So that's one way. And the other way is, if you think about the HMS platform, the governance platform, is that you subsidize the things that you want. You subsidize people that might be, so as an example, think of the urban renewal area. I think everybody would understand that there would be a degree of there's certainly a degree of poverty in those areas. There's a degree of affordability issues. They may or may not be able to own the vehicle. If they own the vehicle, be in pretty rough shape, often, not always, but so that is an area of some social disadvantage. And if that area were focused, that's one way to do it. So we think that John and I think that both of the methods, both the transit leap method and the harmonization management method, are two methods for managing owned fleets and managing regulated fleets. That's why we chose those two.
Well said. Okay, so there are, let's see, here's a question. How can we use real-time road pricing through this transformation?
Well, there's a few ways. The way that I would like to see it is that because especially automated devices, the automated vehicles have full information about where they are, when they're doing it, where they started, where they stopped, how many people are in it, and so forth, so that it would be, I don't want to use the word trivial, but computationally or technically, once an AV is out picking somebody up and taking it somewhere, the technology to determine what that trip ought to cost as a road price becomes trivial. Unlike now, where you have to put up gantries or you have to put in special devices, none of that would have to happen. So the technical cost would be near zero, and that would be done. That could be done that way. So the idea here is to price the use of the roads in real time. We call it time, distance, and place. So what time are you, where are you doing it? How long was it? All those sorts of things are weighed in for the price. And my opinion is that we ought to then use that road pricing to go back into the same system for the mobility disadvantaged, so that those that can afford like a higher end single occupant vehicle are paying prices that are going to fund or subsidize a shared vehicle amongst numerous people that are less able to afford single occupant ride.
Perfect. So there's a few more questions, but I think that what we'll do is we'll take those offline since we're reaching the end of our time. As I said, we're going to do our best to answer all of these questions. And so it is 5:29, and we're clocking down to the last final seconds. So if you have further questions, absolutely reach out by email. Bern and I and John are available and accessible. And so send us your questions or comments. Once again, thank you all for being with us today. We really appreciate the time that you spent with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you sometime soon. Bye for now.